The courtroom wasn't loud that morning. No shouting, no surprises. But the silence. It was suffocating. The air felt thick, pressing down on every breath. The clock ticked. A page turned. A wooden chair creaked under the weight of a judge far too familiar with deciding the fate of others. Jalen Watts, 17 years old, stood beside his public defender, hands cuffed at his waist. The baggy orange jumpsuit swallowed his frame, making him look far younger than he was. His eyes never lifted. He stared at the cold gray tile beneath him. Since the day he was arrested, he'd barely spoken a word. In the row behind him, his mother, Angela Watts, sat frozen. Her hands clutched together so tightly they'd gone pale. Her eyes were bloodshot, dark circles etched deep from sleepless nights. She had called every law office she could find. No one answered. Or if they did, they said things like, "It's too late now." Or worse, "It'll cost too much." The judge flipped through the case file, eyes fixed on the paper, voice flat, like reading off a shipping invoice. In the matter of the state of Georgia versus the defendant, Jalen Watts. The court finds the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. Sentence: life in prison, without parole. No pause, no emotion, just a single clinical line. But it cut through a mother's heart like a blade of ice. "No, no, please, Your Honor. My son didn't do this." Angela bolted upright, but her legs gave out under the weight of despair. She collapsed to the floor, arms reaching forward in helpless desperation. Her sobs were raw, strangled, piercing the air. But they were swallowed whole by the indifference around her. Jalen didn't look back, but in his hand, the drawing of his mother, sketched under a street lamp that night, was now crushed and crumpled. A dream convicted, a life erased, and a system that slammed the door shut behind him, without ever once looking back. Before he became Defendant 247A, Jalen Watts was just a kid, a regular kid, or at least he used to be. He lived with his mother in a small second-floor apartment in Westbrook. One bedroom, an old sofa, a tiny kitchen where his mom would cook simple black bean rice after long shifts at the laundromat. The building wasn't special. The neighborhood wasn't glamorous. But to Jalen, it was home. And for him, that was enough. Jalen wasn't loud. He wasn't good at sports. He didn't like crowds. But he had his own little world. Tucked inside a worn sketchbook he always carried under his arm. Each page was a slice of life. The sleepy security guard nodding off after his shift. The blind neighbor who loved her radio. The sunlight spilling across the school hallway. He loved drawing. Not for praise, not for attention. He drew so the little things wouldn't be forgotten. He would save part of his lunch money just to buy strawberries, his mom's favorite fruit, though she rarely treated herself. On nights when she folded laundry in front of the TV, Jalen would sit quietly across from her, pencil in hand, sketching. He drew the folds in her shirt, the roughness in her calloused hands, her tired face, gentle, still. He never showed that drawing to anyone. He tucked it deep inside his sketchbook, marked with a sticky note that read, "For scholarship portfolio." Section: Family Jalen wasn't a criminal. He was an artist, a good son, a kid who carried dreams to the public library every afternoon, believing that if he worked hard enough, one day the world would see him. But the world chose to see him differently. It was a Thursday afternoon. Clear skies. The sun was just warm enough to make people forget the weight of everyday life. Jalen had just left the library, a USB drive in hand, holding the latest scans of his scholarship portfolio sketches. He smiled quietly to himself, thinking about something Ms. Gloria had said, the elderly librarian who always believed he was destined for something bigger. In his pocket were three familiar things: a bag of chips, a chocolate bar, and a small box of fresh strawberries for his mom. Jalen stepped out of the corner store, barely a block from his street, when it all came crashing down like a storm, without warning. Freeze! Hands in the air! Two police cruisers screeched to a halt in the middle of the road. No sirens, no explanation. One officer shouted, another closed in from behind. I didn't. He didn't even finish the sentence. They slammed him to the ground. His elbow struck the pavement. His face hit the rough sidewalk. Cold steel clamped around his wrists. A voice barked overhead. Black male, green hoodie. Matches the suspect description. Hold him. The bag of chips burst open across the street. The chocolate bar rolled into the gutter. The strawberry box shattered. Red juice spilled across the concrete like blood. And his sketchbook, his most prized possession, hit the ground, pages scattering. The drawing of his mother was torn in half beneath a tire. Jalen didn't fight. He heard his mother's voice, something she'd told him long ago. If you ever get stopped, don't react. Don't argue. Don't run. Just live. And so he stayed silent, because he wanted to live. But the price of that silence was everything. Jalen had exactly 10 minutes to meet the man assigned to protect his legal rights. His name was Hayes. Wrinkled suit, exhausted eyes, one hand on a phone, the other gripping a paper-thin file. He didn't ask Jalen much, didn't even look at him for long. He skimmed a few lines, then spoke in a voice drained of life. Anything you want to say before we go in? Jalen nodded faintly. I was at the library. There's video. The librarian, her name's Gloria. She can confirm. Hayes cut him off with a tired nod. Yeah, we'll see. And then the courtroom doors opened, and the truth, if it ever had a chance, never made it in with him. No jury, just a few court clerks staring at paperwork. Judge Roland Pierce sat high on the bench, face carved in stone. He never once looked Jalen in the eyes. The prosecutor laid it out quickly. A blurry photo from a GameStop security camera. A single art glove found in Jalen's backpack. A partial fingerprint that might be a match. That was it. No library video, no testimony from Ms. Gloria, no GPS records, no time verification, nothing. When asked if he had a rebuttal, Mr. Hayes stood, adjusted his tie, and offered, "My client is a student with no prior record. He says he was at the library. Do you have a witness? Haven't been able to reach her." Jalen opened his mouth. "Please ask the librarian. She knows." But the prosecutor snapped. "You're not allowed to speak." Judge Pierce said nothing. He glanced at the file, then up at the clock. Sufficient cause. Remanded to custody. Bail denied. The sound of the gavel hit like a pre-recorded soundtrack, as if this scene had been played out many times before. Jalen didn't just lose. He never had a chance to fight. 3 weeks after his arrest, Jalen sat on the edge of a cold metal bed in a juvenile detention cell in Fulton County. The lights never turned off at night. The days passed without anyone ever calling his name. Time blurred, like a videotape stuck in slow motion. Only pencils and paper weren't tightly monitored. That day, during the allowed phone hour, a guard tapped the railing. "You've got a call. Make it quick." Jalen stood. His hands trembled, not from fear, but because he could only remember one phone number. It wasn't his mom's. She couldn't afford to accept collect calls. It was a number she'd made him memorize at age 10. That man hadn't called in years, not on birthdays, not since the silence set in. But somewhere in Jalen's faded memory was a voice that once said, "If you ever get lost, call your father." And today, he did. In Washington, D.C., inside a grand press conference at the Department of Justice, Luther Pryor, The Attorney General of the United States had just finished a statement on equal justice under the law when his phone buzzed in his pocket. A strange number. One buzz, then another. He paused, lifted his hand. "Excuse me, I need to step out for a moment." Behind the soundproof doors, he answered, "This is Luther Pryor." Silence. Then a shaky breath and a voice, hoarse, fragile, but painfully familiar. "It's me. Jalen, I need help." Luther froze. His heart tightened, not just from shock, but from guilt crashing over him like a wave. All those years, he had chosen to stay away, to keep his distance, to not get involved. And now, the son he'd left behind was behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, in the very system Luther had once believed in, without question. "Where are you?" "Fulton Juvenile. They said I robbed a store, but I didn't. No one's listening to me." Luther leaned against the wall. His hands trembled. The press room behind him faded into silence. This wasn't a case file anymore. This wasn't another headline. This was his son. And for the first time in years, Luther didn't turn away. That night, in a dark corner office on the 15th floor of the Department of Justice, Luther Pryor was no longer the Attorney General. He wasn't seated at a conference table. He wasn't debating reforms with aides. He wasn't facing cameras or speaking about justice on national television. He was just sitting, alone. His suit jacket hung off the back of his chair. His tie hung loose around his neck. The only light came from his laptop screen, casting shadows across a face etched with worry. At the top of the digital file glared one name: Jalen Watts, File 492A, Fulton County. The first few lines stopped him cold. The traffic cam footage, supposed to confirm Jalen's alibi, was no longer in the file. The metadata scan showed timestamps had been altered. The sunlight in the footage didn't match the actual time of day. And the license plate on a background car? Too clear. The forensic report suspiciously clear. Originally, the fingerprint had been labeled inconclusive, but the version presented in court? It now read, likely match with suspect. He didn't stop there. Luther accessed the judicial record of Judge Roland Pierce. With every scroll, his chest grew tighter. 94% of Pierce's sentences against black and brown juveniles were the maximum allowed. Average trial time, under 2 days. Nearly every defense motion had been denied. This wasn't a courtroom. It was an assembly line. The next morning, in a windowless basement of the Justice Department, Luther gathered 4 young attorneys. No cameras, no ceremony. Just 4 people who still believed in the law, because it hadn't yet broken them. Sarah Chen, legal tech specialist. Marcus Wright, criminal defense. Daniela Ruiz, civil rights attorney. Jamal Thomas, federal procedure expert. No introductions, no grand speeches. Luther simply said, "I don't need you to save my reputation. I need you to save a child. Start with Jalen, but don't stop there." And in that sealed, silent room, the real investigation began. Elena Vargas wasn't one for the spotlight. For 5 years behind the clerk's desk at Fulton County Court, she typed fast, nodded politely, avoided eye contact, and never let emotion surface. The system liked people like her. Quiet, precise, invisible. But the case of Jalen Watts left a crack in that silence. She still remembered entering the case file before the hearing. There were documents, at first. Library camera footage. A system error report from GameStop. A note that the glove size didn't match. But the next morning, those files were gone. In their place, a slimmer packet, thrown together, cleansed. Elena knew that wasn't normal. But Judge Pierce wasn't someone you questioned. No one in that courthouse dared to. Days later, An anonymous email landed in the inbox of the Special Task Force. No signature, no subject line, just one sentence. I have documents. Meet me. No names, no cameras, just truth. At a quiet cafe on the edge of downtown, Elena arrived. Collar pulled high, face tight with nerves, a worn canvas tote in hand, with one USB drive inside. Across the table sat Sarah Chen and Marcus Wright, two young attorneys from the underground investigation team. Elena sat. No handshake, just slid the USB across the table. It's all in there. Check the timestamps. Then she added, voice low, her eyes slowly scanning the cafe. Pierce rerouted Jalen's case to his courtroom before the assignments were finalized. No approval, no explanation. But I know why. Sarah held her breath. Why? Elena's hands tightened into fists. The director of the juvenile facility where Jalen was sent is Judge Pierce's nephew. And just like that, the whole puzzle began to crack. Within 4 damp, cracked walls and lights that never fully shut off, Jalen was no longer just a defendant. He became a recorder of the lives the world had forgotten. One afternoon in the prison yard, Marcus, the older man in charge of the laundry, leaned in and whispered, "My little girl's doing spoken word at her graduation, just like her mom, stubborn and always smiling." Jalen gave a quiet nod, and hours later, he drew. A little girl on stage, clutching a notebook, lips shaping poetry, and in the distance, a father in prison uniform, watching from the shadows. And then, more faces came. Deshawn, 18, who hummed old Motown songs while mopping floors. Carlos, who dreamed of owning a taco truck. William, who grew vegetables in plastic bins beneath the yard's fleeting sun. Each face, each glance, each word. Jalen captured it all. One day, his quiet roommate Jamal slipped him a roll of real drawing paper. From the volunteer writing teacher, draw before they take it away. Jalen drew. And then, he passed the originals to the teacher, Mrs. Lavania, with a thin line of pencil scrawled on the envelope. Inside voices, we're still here. 2 weeks later, the first sketch appeared in a local artist collective, then on Twitter, then Instagram, 1 portrait, then 10, then a full series, each with a caption, written by someone on the inside. I didn't run because I was guilty. I ran because I was scared to die. She used to sing every night. Now I only hear the wind. My name is Jordan, but they just call me Inmate 532. Civil rights lawyers began sharing them. Street artists painted the portraits on city walls. A gallery in D.C. cleared its entire exhibition to display Jalen's drawings. And across social media, one hashtag began to rise. The silence now had found its sound. That morning, the congressional hearing room was no longer a place for charts and political promises. Sunlight streamed through towering glass windows, casting quiet beams across the still folders in front of U.S. senators. At the center of the room stood Luther Pryor, not as Attorney General, only a single briefcase. Inside, no graphs, no analytics, no policy reports, just art, drawings by Jalen, faces forgotten, eyes never truly seen, people locked away, but never truly heard. Luther opened the folder, one drawing, then another, then an entire sequence, projected onto the large screen behind him. A father clutching a worn plastic toy. She still asks when I'm coming home. A teenager staring out a cell window. I'm not a monster. I just didn't have a lawyer. A man with his eyes closed. I still hear my mother's hymns in my sleep. Luther didn't need to argue. The drawings spoke for him. Outside the Capitol, thousands had gathered. Law students held up printed portraits. Mothers clutched signs that read, "Justice has no skin color, inside voices, outside truth." That boy could be my son. A group of artists projected Jalen's work onto the Supreme Court's marble walls, merging with the sky, as if justice itself was finally speaking. National television interrupted broadcasts. CNN's ticker ran, "Teen inmates art shakes U.S. justice system." NPR declared, "Inside Voices emerges as defining civil rights movement of the 21st century." Inside the hearing, Luther bowed his head. His voice was low, but each word cut like a chisel. "I used to believe the system would heal itself, but now I know justice can't wait. It can't pretend, and it can't stay silent anymore." And for the first time in years, lawmakers fell silent, not out of strategy, but out of truth. The appellate courtroom didn't look anything like the one where Jalen was sentenced. Here, sunlight poured through towering arched windows. There were no clinking shackles, no averted eyes. Everything felt clear, orderly, and for the first time just. Jalen walked in no longer in prison orange, a white shirt, hands slightly trembling. But beside him stood a full team: civil rights attorneys, forensic experts, and his mother, Angela, seated just behind him, her eyes full of hope, though not yet belief. Presiding over the case was Judge Diana Martinez, a former juvenile defense lawyer. She wasn't cold, she wasn't careless. Every glance, every question she asked, made it clear she was listening. The case file was opened, evidence presented, the library footage that had been hidden, the tampered forensic report, the timeline, the GPS data, everything aligned, everything undeniable. Then, an unexpected witness. A privacy screen was pulled into the center of the room, and from behind it, a voice, shaky but firm. "My name is Elena Vargas. I was a clerk for Judge Pierce. I saw him alter records. I know he reassigned Jalen's case to his courtroom without protocol." The room fell silent, and when she read her final line, her voice broke. Jalen never had a chance, because from the beginning, the system decided he wouldn't get one. Judge Martinez looked down at the file, then back up at Jalen. Her voice wasn't loud, but it thundered through the room. Based on newly presented evidence, serious judicial misconduct, and violations of due process, this court hereby vacates the conviction. Jalen Watts, you are free to go. No one clapped. No one cheered. There was only the sound of a mother sobbing and the trembling grip between a son and the father who was finally there. Justice can't return lost time, but today it finally spoke. The night Jalen returned home, the room he once called his tiny universe looked just the same: peeling paint on the walls, a tilted bookshelf leaning to one side, a worn particle board desk with a crack in the left corner. But the space was no longer silent. He stood in the middle of the room, took a deep breath, then walked to a drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper, thick, smooth, untouched. He'd saved it long ago, back when he still believed in scholarships, when he still drew his mother under the lamplight. Now, he took a small nail and gently pinned it to the wall. In the old room, in a new life. No words, no sketch, just white, a beginning. They had tried to erase him from the system, from the story, from the collective memory. But now, the world was listening, and Jalen Watts was no longer invisible. He had become a symbol for everyone who had never been given the chance to speak. Outside, Jalen's drawings still illuminated the Capitol building. The Inside Voices movement had spread to Europe, to Africa, and into juvenile cells across America. Other black boys, once called by numbers, were now being called by name, and their stories were being told in drawings. Jalen sat down, took a pencil, and wrote a small line in the corner of that blank page. Freedom doesn't begin when a door opens. It begins when someone sees you as human. If Jalen's story moved, you don't let it end here. Share this video. Repost a drawing. Say the name of someone who's been forgotten. And hit subscribe to stand with real people, telling real stories who need your voice, now more than ever. One voice, one truth, one action. It starts with you.